This is the craziest UFO phenomenon true story, and it came from my dad. In the 1960s in Ethiopia, my dad was just a child 9 years old at the time, playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was the Minister of the Interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple of hours pass, his parents, my dad's parents, and guards are searching, but no Gabriel. 48 hours pass, and now there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid. It's on the news. Police are searching door to door, describing him and what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing his private school uniform, a white shirt and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him, but still nothing. A month passes, then 2, then 4, and people start losing hope that he will ever be found and think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day he disappeared, Gabriel appeared back in my dad's backyard. He was wearing the same white shirt private school uniform, and it was still clean. He looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they confirmed he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple of nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men, who looked like white guys, could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying, even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and had cars flying around him. He said there were people there, but they looked strange, like us but different. One nice man was still with him and took him to a tall building, where he said he had to stay for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said he could push a button, and the room itself goes places. An open field, the beach, the room itself even flies. He said after a couple of hours, he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was only gone a couple of hours total. No one believed him, and Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel was even forced to see a priest to get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics and I believe works in Holland. Mine happened in the early 2000s when I was around 16. My brother, my friend's father, and I were catfishing on Lake Okeechobee in Florida. The father had a large pontoon houseboat, so we stayed out there all night. Anyway, the father had gone to bed, and at about 2 a.m. I decided I was going to bed as well. I had been lying down for about 5 minutes when my brother and friend came into the cabin and told me to wake up. I wasn't asleep yet, so I just got up. We walked out onto the deck, and they both pointed out west in the sky. There was this orangish-blue ball floating and moving side to side a bit. We just stared at it for a few minutes. As we kept watching, it changed color, shifting from orange to bluish to greenish and back. There was no pattern. It also moved in different directions. Finally, after a few minutes, it just shot off and was gone. We weren't drinking or doing drugs, but we all saw it. Kind of freaked us out, but it was pretty cool. I have no idea what it was, but it was very strange. It wasn't a helicopter or plane, that much I know. This happened probably back in about 95 to 96. At the time, I was a pizza delivery guy. I was out on a delivery, and after the delivery, I was returning to the store. While driving along the highway, I noticed 3 still lights, almost in a row, way off above the horizon. It was evening, and stars were visible. My first thought was that they were from planes heading to the airport, as they were way brighter than the stars. I thought they only looked still because I was driving on the highway, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the course of the next few minutes, as I continued down the highway, I noticed the center light started moving up. It continued into the shape of a triangle. I tried to keep an eye on the triangle of lights in the distance as the whole thing started moving up in the sky. I eventually lost sight of this thing behind trees and whatever else, and I made it back to work. I was utterly confused by the whole thing and didn't tell anyone because I figured they'd think I was crazy. I kind of even thought to myself I was seeing things and making it up. I don't know why I remember this part. This all happened about a week before the Super Bowl. It might have even been the Friday before the Super Bowl. I'm unsure. All I remember is that before the Super Bowl, I was watching the Sci-Fi Channel. Some shows were about people who had seen UFOs. I was always skeptical at best. Then they did a segment on the numerous sightings of triangle-shaped lights and started showing clips of the few examples that people had caught on video. It was exactly what I had seen. I've never seen anything like it since, and no one else reported any strange sightings that weekend that I knew of. Of course, I was a dumb early 20s kid, so I didn't pay attention to local news, but I'll never forget that incident. When I was around 7 years old, I was primarily raised at the time by my grandparents who lived in a rural county in East Texas. I'll never forget one day when we had a most unusual man come by the house one afternoon unexpectedly. I remember there being a knock at the door as I was playing in the living room at the time and called up to announce to my grandparents someone was at the door. My grandmother took a quick peek out the front window before answering the door, and I remember glimpsing at a very dark-colored or black sedan parked outside. Thinking back, I find it odd that, at the time, I couldn't recall hearing it pull up as I had been playing near that window for some time. My grandmother answered the door, and to the best of my recollection, the man revealed himself to be some sort of door-to-door salesman. My grandmother invited him in and called for my grandfather. I never in my life had seen a man so pale. He was dressed in essentially all black or very dark blue suit, with a matching hat and large sunglasses, which made me wonder if he was blind, and one of the saddest excuses for a toupee I've yet to bear witness to. I was totally transfixed on the man and couldn't get over the stark contrast of his pale skin to his seemingly drawn-on with lipstick pinkish lips. My fixation became apparent, and my grandmother shooed me into a back room to leave the men to talk, so to speak, uninterrupted. Throughout the visit, I kept trying to sneak peeks at the man and commented to my grandmother whether or not she thought he was sick as he was so pale and thin. Eventually, I suppose he finished his pitch and eventually made his way, quite slowly, for an exit. I recall as he was leaving, he seemingly thanked both my grandparents. I couldn't make out everything that was said, but I recall he did something more odd than his appearance. He seemed to pass his hands in front of both of my grandparents' faces and said something to both, but all I could make out was the word forget. And soon he was on his way. My grandparents seemed to be momentarily in a dull fog after closing the door and quietly pulling off. Never saw him drive off. I immediately asked them who that man was, and they looked at each other and said, "What man?" Now, as you can understand, all three of us were quite baffled. Them as having no recollection of a visitor and me having no rational explanation as to how in the hell they couldn't remember that freaking wackadoo-looking salesman. I went on for weeks asking them who the man was and trying to jog their memory. And as always, they said there was no one. They even went as far as to say I was mixing up another business acquaintance of my grandfather who had him drop by one day. But I assured them there was no way I could confuse the two, as the man in question was paler than Gollum in the Lord of the Ring trilogy, and their friend was nothing of the sort. I had almost forgotten about the incident entirely until watching a show on Sci-Fi Channel related to a man in black theme, and it came back to me. As recently as a year ago, I tried to bring it up again when I was home visiting, and my grandfather didn't remember a thing, while my grandmother again didn't recall the strange man but vividly remembers me asking for weeks on end about a strange man neither of them ever remembered setting foot in the house. This happened back in the mid-'80s, and I'm in my early 30s now looking back, and a lot of the details aren't as crisp, but I know what I saw. I saw a UFO up close, probably from 30 feet away tops. I'm pretty certain that it was of military design, though. I was out driving with my younger brother near a military base in Tucson, Arizona, probably not even 2 miles from my house. It was about 10 p.m. or so, and there were no cars on the road. I was making a left at an intersection, and right as I completed my turn, I heard it approaching from behind us. Literally, the sound that they play as an effect for hovercraft in movies. That was what I was hearing. It started out quiet but got louder as the craft got closer. Since it was obviously heading above us, my brother leaned out the window and exclaimed loudly, "It's a UFO!" To which I responded by hitting the brakes. What I saw shocked me and has had me convinced ever since. As I came to a stop, the craft glided above us, and I watched the wings detach like a transformer robot and lower themselves from the craft by about 5 to 10 feet. The wings at this point were supported only by 2 rods connected to the craft. There were 2 giant thrusters on each wing, as well as an even larger one on the bottom of the main body of the craft. The shape and the movements suggested that it was in some sort of VTOL mode, because as it changed into this VTOL mode, it swung around and did a complete 180 over a 2-story building just ahead of us to our left, barely missing the roof with its wings. Then it reconnected the wings, forming a triangular shape, and it boosted off back over our heads at an incredible speed. To further describe the craft, it had 2 modes as far as we could tell. One where the craft is consolidated into a triangular shape and seems to be designed for quick horizontal travel, while the other mode allowed for VTOL movements. It could switch between modes in like 5 seconds or less, and in VTOL mode it almost looked like the body of a stealth bomber but with 2 sword-shaped objects underneath it. And of course with thrusters facing at like a 45-degree angle, but they were adjustable. The whole thing was pitch black, and we would have never noticed it if we hadn't had the radio off and heard it approaching from behind. I got an incredibly good look at it because even though it was late, the craft was flying so low that I could see it via the street lights. My brother was so scared afterward that he immediately called the cops. Pretty amazing experience, all in all. This event occurred in 2011 and has haunted me every day since. I work in networking and all of our shifts are late. I usually get off around 2 a.m. and then I am up for a few hours before I go to bed. This evening I got off work and it was raining really bad on my way home. When I got home, by chance, the clouds broke and I stepped outside to have a quick smoke. One of my buddies called me and we were chatting about work. It was still not raining and there were low-lying clouds. There are orange street lights in Allen, and they were reflecting off the bottom of the clouds, creating an artificial light. There was a pretty good breeze whipping around, but no rain. I was facing west, and I looked to my right and I saw a black cube moving out of the north and traveling south at about 60 to 80 miles per hour. It was moving with a corner forward. This thing was huge. I was astonished to the core of my soul. I sat speechless for a few seconds, knowing that I was seeing something amazing. It was 80 to 100 foot tall. It was a black cube in shape and looked like a rough stone surface. On the side of the cube was a border, and within the border was a circular symbol, if that's what it even was. It looked like you were drawing a circular maze. It was disturbing the air behind it and created a vaporous trail spinning behind it and then disappearing. There was absolutely no sound. None. If you know Dallas, it was traveling in the direction of southbound 75 Central Expressway towards downtown. I told my buddy what I had seen, and he lives a few miles south. I fumbled over my words telling him and asked him to go outside to see if he could see it. He went out to the middle of his street and looked in the direction that it was coming from. After about 5 minutes, it started to rain again. He stood out in the rain for another 15 minutes but never saw it. Anyways, no one can ever tell me that I didn't see what I saw that night. I have been ridiculed and laughed at, but I know what I saw. It is almost a relief at this point to know that they are really here. I have been a long-time lurker, and I had to get this off my chest. I have been searching for Black Cube UFO for years now, every single day. I cannot stop thinking about it. I have to see it again. Thanks for listening. Let me preface this by stating that almost all of the encounters that I have witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first 2 encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days a year and a half ago. I do not recall being abducted. I have filed reports with the incredibly incompetent Mutual UFO Network. Back in '97, my buddy and I had just finished up our shift at a pizza joint. It was after 11 p.m. We were worn out and wanted to get stoned. We were completely sober. Anyway, we drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about a half mile off the road, it was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed when I notice what I believe to be truck headlights shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic. I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I am messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brick weed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds, this star starts moving up and down, side to side, and in circles. I yelled in a panic, "What the fuck is that?" My buddy gives a dismissive sigh, and then he looks where I am pointing. For 5 minutes, the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and doing so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some kind of formation, and other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as the 5 came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving too much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time, the one object turned into at least 7 objects. The way they moved and jerked around felt aggressive to me. My friend must have felt the same way because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go. I embarrassingly confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul ass out of there, and this thing follows us to the outskirts of town. On the night after, me and the same buddy walked across my apartment complex to go visit with a neighbor who was about to grill some burgers. The sun was just starting to set on a humid midsummer afternoon. We knocked on the door and my neighbor let us in. With him was his girlfriend, her sister, and some random guy that I didn't know. I went out back with Ray to chit-chat while he fired up the Kingsford. It was just the 2 of us, so I took the opportunity to tell him about the previous night. The stars were just starting to come out, and in my storytelling, I pointed one out just so Ray would know exactly what I meant. I was still pretty much tripped out, so I was fairly excited when describing everything. I was almost done with my story when I noticed Ray looking at the stars that were just beginning to appear. I mean, this guy was looking around everywhere. It was like he became instantly paranoid. While I was in mid-sentence, Ray pointed to the northeast and yelled, "Like that? Right fucking there? Holy shit, the goosebumps." He yelled inside for everyone to come out. They did so, and soon after, the same situation as mentioned above started to occur. That went on for a bit. It went on so long that everyone but Ray and myself went inside. We ate our burgers while watching this. Behind Ray's apartment was a field. 300 yards away on the other side of the field was a tree line and creek. On the other side of that tree line was another field. This object slowly descended towards the tree line, and I opened the door and yelled for everyone to come back out. We watched this huge fiery orb, in complete silence, land on the other side of the tree line. When we lost direct sight of it, we could still see the light through the trees. Right before the light disappeared, it became very bright. We all kept asking each other if it was real, and this part is where I may lose some of you, but fuck it. After several minutes, and the end of all sunlight, nothing was happening. Everyone was in and out of the house. I remember standing in front of the back door talking to Ray's girlfriend in the kitchen. Ray, my buddy from the previous night, and the girlfriend's sister were outside. My buddy says, "Oh shit," under his breath and darts past me. The sister is right behind him. Ray shoves me in the door and almost falls on top of me. The girlfriend screams, slams the door shut, and locks it. We all back away from the door. After all of the WTF was that speak, we decided it was 4-legged, covered in brown fur, and tried to attack us. This apartment was a townhouse. We all went upstairs to get a better look. There it was in the shadows. It was pacing around and keeping an eye out. This is when they appeared. They came out of the darkness. They were short, around 3 foot tall. The skin tone was grayish with a bit of Caucasian color. These were short grays. There were several of them. Meanwhile, the animal thing started to climb a utility pole. This wasn't a typical utility pole. It had 6 or 8 transformers on it, was H-shaped and kind of low. When the beast started to climb, I watched it shapeshift to a degree. It decided to perch on one of the cross beams. It looked right at us, but its focus seemed to be on the ETs. It acted like a guard dog, for lack of better words. The Greys were clothed, and they had some sort of instruments. They seemed preoccupied by the field. They would look at us on occasion, but they were doing something. What exactly, I don't know. This went on for hours. Eventually, we all went back downstairs. Every once in a while, I would go check to see if they were gone. As soon as it was all clear, I ran home. That was it. For the next 4 years, I pretty much believed it was random. And then, after meeting my biological father for the very first time, my ex-wife jokingly brought up my UFO stories over dinner and wine. When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting, fixing, and stuff as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just from the UFOs and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other. So my mom chased us off and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out night fishing with our dad. The stars were amazing looking without the city's light pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there is no such constellation, yet here it was. While we were looking at it, all the stars took off silently in different directions and vanished over all the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone. But we were spooked and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where Mom was sleeping. About halfway there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we got into the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when we tried to talk about it, Dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stupid stories. My sister asked, "Why did you run then?" He said that he was tired and wanted to get to bed was all. He was tired, so he ran? My dad could be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask to use Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Never did see the purple glowing mist, though we looked for it. I'm not sure if this counts as an alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago and have been dying to tell the story. About 5 years ago, 2 friends and I were on our way back from Warped Tour in Maryland, being driven by one of the friends' moms because none of us had a car we could drive yet. It was almost night. The sun was still kind of out and it wasn't that dark yet. We were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes. Everyone in the car was screaming our heads off. Not because it was a look out for that deer situation, but because this was the scariest fucking looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long gangly limbs, and moppy black long stringy hair. This thing moved so fucking weird. I can see it clearly to this day. It galloped so awkwardly, did not run at all like a deer or anything of the sort. When it jumped off the back 2 legs and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down and galloping across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing, which was, "What the fuck was that thing?" To this day, I am convinced it was a demon, an alien, or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I have ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times years after the fact, and it still gives everyone shivers. I have one. I don't know where I stand on the whole UFO controversy, but I can vividly recall an experience from my childhood that I've never forgotten and can't explain. I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. I distinctly remember it because it caused in me a sense of terror more pure than any I had or have felt since. My parents' house is out in the country, and my old bedroom is on the second floor, with 2 windows facing north and west respectively. My bed was up against the west wall just beneath the window. My dog Henry was sleeping with me that night. I woke up to the sound of Henry barking and found my room bathed in light from the window above my bed. I can vividly recall Henry silhouetted, staring into the light, barking her brains out. I jerked up and looked out, but there was only light. A crackly, humming, droning sound filled the air. I was disoriented and terrified, both for myself and for my dog, but all I could do was pull my blankets over my head and curl into a ball. I was sure Henry was going to die. I remember feeling sorry that I was too frightened to help. In my head, the clear thought, "I don't want to die," repeated over and over, and I was aware that it was the first time in my life that I had ever really not wanted to die. It was the first time I'd ever genuinely felt that I was going to die. The experience ends there. I woke up the next morning with Henry in my bed. I immediately went to my parents' room and woke them up to ask if they'd seen the light or heard Henry barking. But they hadn't. I wondered if I'd dreamt it, but I'd never had a dream so visceral before. All the fear I'd experienced up until that point became a lower classification. Now there was fear, and there was real fear. When I first heard about sleep paralysis, my mind immediately went to that night. It had some of the same characteristics, the terror, the vividness, the weird noise, but I wasn't paralyzed. I moved twice. Once when I sat up and peeked into the light, and again when I pulled my blankets over my head and hid.